that no single party in the history of the state of Israel has ever had an absolute majority and been able to rule on their own. I know in the UK, you had a recent example of a coalition government, and obviously there are those who have different opinions on those, but in Israel, it's always a coalition government, and it's usually at least 4, 5, 6, 7, perhaps even more parties. So what happened in those first elections where everyone thought the right-wing bloc was to receive, I think it was 65 people recommended Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time to the president. That's the way the system works. And everyone thought that a government would be formed along those lines. But at the last minute, Avigdor Lieberman expressed a fervent hope that one of the items on the agenda for the new government would be that the ultra-Orthodox would be recruited to the army, at least in minimal numbers at first, but according to a law that had been written up by the defense establishment in coordination and consultation with civic leaders, including rabbis. That was unsatisfactory to the rest of the coalition, primarily the ultra-Orthodox parties, and there was a lot of pushing and shoving at the time, but everyone thought someone would come down from the tree. I was pretty certain at the time that it wouldn't be Avigdor Lieberman, knowing him as well as I do. The ultra-Orthodox weren't going to come down, but I thought maybe they'd possibly be some sort of compromise. And I can tell you that even members of Israel Beitenu, up until the last minute, thought that maybe there would be, but there wasn't. And we basically were in unprecedented territory where, rather than offer to another MK to be able to form a government, Prime Minister Netanyahu basically called on his supporters and even some of the opposition to pull through an immediate ending of that Knesset. So the only law that first Knesset, after those elections, passed was to disperse itself. So we were already in unprecedented territory then. We since had 2 more elections, really in unprecedented territory. So for a year and a half, we had a caretaker government, essentially. We didn't have a government. No one was able to form the majority. Basically, you know, the two blocks that have always been there in Israeli politics, the left and the right, were split. None of them were able to get over 60. Avigdor Lieberman had that sort of blocking vote for either. After that first elections, he said that he would support a unity government, and he's maintained that ever since. But basically what we saw after these last elections, as James, you said before, we saw a party which had basically run on a platform, you know, anyone but Bibi, and, you know, we have to get rid of Netanyahu because of the court cases, the indictment against him for corruption, and other serious cases. But as we saw at the last minute, when he had very strong cards to play, and in theory, Benny Gantz had the numbers to pass a law that would have ensured that Netanyahu would not be able to be prime minister until after the cases, by making an amendment to the basic law. The basic law in Israel says that if you are a minister under indictment, you have to resign from the government. But the law does not state that about a prime minister. So there would have been, so basically Benny Gantz had the numbers. He had all the cards at that point. And, you know, to use the sort of, you know, the card playing analogy, he folded very early and gave all the cards to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is the supreme poker player here in Israel. You know, no one can touch him from that point of view. And ever since we've been moving towards unity government, a lot of people thought even in the weeks since then, there wouldn't be a unity government, and Netanyahu was just doing it to basically break up his main rival and then go to new elections. There are still, and Channel 12, which is one of the main news channels, excuse me, in Israel, has just said that there are rumors that Netanyahu still may go for 4th elections, may find some ruse to go for 4th elections. The polls are looking very, very good for Netanyahu at the moment. His party is rising above 41, and with the whole right-wing bloc without Avigdor Lieberman are polling around 63, 64. I personally believe, and I have believed from the beginning, that there will be a unity government, quite simply because it's a comfortable place for Netanyahu. Netanyahu, don't forget, is under indictment. He faces, you know, a lot of challenges, not least, like every other leader around the world, the coronavirus crisis. And whether the polls are looking good for him at the moment, everyone knows that 3 months is a very long time, especially in Israeli politics. And if there's another peak, Israel's doing pretty well with the coronavirus. We're now relieving restrictions left, right, and center, and we're going to be back to some sort of normal existence in the middle of June, according to the timetable that was laid out. But what's to say a second peak couldn't happen just before elections? There was over 1 million people unemployed in this country. There's a lot of anger and resentment about the way that the economy has been run. The payments to freelance workers, to small businesses have not been forthcoming. So I think Netanyahu is far more wily politician than I will ever be. I think he knows that these polls are a snapshot of satisfaction over the way he's dealt with coronavirus. But, as we see, I always use this example, even with the people I'm working around the world at the moment, that, during a crisis, there's always that point of rallying around the solidarity with the leader and the leadership. But then at some point, as the crisis goes further and further, you start to lose faith and you start to see your situation deteriorate. And who do you blame? The leadership. The classic example for that, to my mind at least, is Winston Churchill after the Second World War. This is a guy who basically won the World War, and a few months later he was trounced at the elections. Now, British political historians will probably find another 100 reasons why he lost those elections, but there was economic uncertainty, social instability, going out of the Second World War, and the guy who was a hero to many basically got trounced at the next election. So I think, it's too much unknown, and I do believe that Netanyahu is sincere about wanting a national unity government. I think it is, according to all polls, something which most Israelis want. It is highly supported, and I think it's necessary because we simply cannot have a caretaker government during this time, because it's such a crucial time. There's so many things that need to be arranged. So the way it is at the moment is that Netanyahu has just been given, literally in the last hour, the ability to form a government by the president. He now has 14 days in which to do so. He's already signed up blue and white. I believe he's also signed up at least the Ashkenazi Haredi Party, United Torah Judaism. Shas will follow suit. The Derech Eretz Party, which is an offshoot of the Telem Party, which is part now of Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, which is sitting in the government, but two right-wing members of that, in fact, two former very close confidants of Netanyahu, Tzvika Hauser and Yoas Hendel, two good friends of mine, have broken off from there and they've joined the government. And that gives Netanyahu something very crucial, even though these are two people who do not like Netanyahu. They know him very well personally, but they have decided that a unity government is the most important thing. And at least one of them will be a minister, and probably the other one will be given a very high-ranking chairmanship of a Knesset committee. You also have, as James, you mentioned before, 2 out of the 3 Labour Party members, which is quite extraordinary because Labour were running with Meretz, and Meretz is about as far left on the Zionist political spectrum as you can go. Yeah. So, up to a month ago, this was a leader who was, as I said, as far probably away from Netanyahu, some of his allies as you can get on the Israeli political spectrum. And here he is sitting in a government, not just sitting in a government, but sitting in a government where one of the main principles are that after July 1st, this government can enact policies of annexing territories, not all the territory. We don't know how much, where, what. That's not in the agreement itself. But after July 1st, this government would be allowed to annex territory, at least according to Israeli law. Now, obviously, there's a lot to be taken into account with that, but it's quite a remarkable thing that a party running with Meretz a month ago is now sitting in a government with annexation as one of its central policies. So I think it's, we live in very interesting times, as the Chinese like to say. We live in absolutely unprecedented times. So, there could be some surprises. Israeli political commentators say there's always some surprises. I'm not so sure. I think we pretty much do know who's going to be in the next government. The question is who's going to get a ministerial position. Actually, let me take that step back. We know almost everybody who's going to be in the next government. The big question mark that remains is Yamina. Yamina is the right-wing national religious party led by Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, Rafi Peretz, Bezalel Smotrich. They're all kind of co-leaders because they all have different factions within the party. And they are basically pressing to be in the government. And interestingly enough, because annexation is already in the agreement, they can't really make that an issue. So they're pushing other issues. Naftali Bennett, who is currently defense minister, really wants to be health minister. He believes that he can deal with the health, the crisis that is and possibly will be in the future. He's got quite a good reputation. And I think there was a poll of who most people wanted to be the next health minister. And I think he came out on top. There were some who say that it should be a professional, someone from a health background, because especially in a crisis, we need someone who understands that world. But basically, it's not clear exactly what will bring them in. There's no love lost between Bennett and Netanyahu. Netanyahu would love to leave Bennett out, but I think that he will come in quite simply because if he joins as well, then Netanyahu is in a situation where no single party in this quite large government can bring the government down. Now that's, again, quite rare. But I think that gives him a certain amount of stability. Yep. The agreement itself allows for something extraordinary, the agreement between Blue and White and Likud, to have two sort of prime ministers at one time. What I mean is we'll have one prime minister and one, I can never remember how they say that in English, replacement prime minister, alternate prime minister, I think is probably the best term. And after a year and a half, these two are meant to swap. So at the moment, it's going to be Netanyahu who's going to be prime minister and Benny Gantz will be alternate prime minister. That's a brand new position which they've had to create new laws for. And in a year and a half, they're supposed to swap. Now, most Israelis, again, according to polls, do not believe that Netanyahu will give up his position very easily. There are some theories that next year the presidency becomes open as Rivlin finishes his 7-year term, and there are some who are saying that it's a perfect time to give it to Netanyahu. Especially, he'll be in a position where he has the right to pardon someone, and there's possibly no one he'd most like to pardon than himself. There is that theory, but the idea that he would give it over to Gantz when Gantz would be extremely weak. Gantz would be the leader of a party of 15 in a government of in the late 70s, I believe. I think that's unlikely. I don't think Likud would allow that to happen, with or without Netanyahu. But I think this gives Netanyahu a year and a half of stability. He knows that Gantz has everything to lose by trying to make trouble. The ultra-Orthodox parties generally don't make much trouble if they're given what they want ahead of time. Yamina could make some trouble, and Netanyahu would certainly prefer them to be inside than outside, attacking him from the right, because he'll already probably have Lieberman attacking him from the right on the outside of the opposition. But Naftali Bennett at this point, on the right wing voter base, there's a certain amount of overlap between Likud and Yamina. So I think he would prefer probably to have him within the coalition. My prediction is they'll all come in. It will be a very bloated government with, I believe, something like 55 ministers and deputy ministers, the most ever in history of Israel, which will cost the taxpayers over, if it lasts the 4 years, over $1 billion shekels. There's certainly an argument to be made whether that money could be better spent at this point, but that's where we are because of the nature of Israeli politics. I didn't want to go back to sort of the history of Israel, but we have a system, we have a proportional representation system, which was understandable at the beginning of the state, because at the beginning of the state you had so many different groups, whether it was religious, ultra-Orthodox, left, right, Arabs, all the different groups, and the idea was to have as many have representation in the Knesset, and that was the right decision, because if everyone feels that they have their representatives in the legislature, then obviously they feel represented, and obviously it makes for a stronger democracy. But I do believe that that system has outlived its use, and I wrote papers even, I believe, in 2010 when I was working in the government, that we are moving towards political paralysis. I mean, it took 8 or 9 years, but I think we've proved it over a year and a half that the system is broken. And I think we need to fix it. Unfortunately, I don't think that we will fix it. But hopefully there will be some level of resentment, fear, whatever it is, that was, manifested over the last year and a half. The fact that we had to go to 3 elections and almost a 4th, that there is really a time, this really is a time and place to really look at our system and think, how can we keep it highly representative, which is what we have, but also highly governable, or more governable than it is, because obviously, as I said, it's not the most governable system in the world. And we certainly don't just see that around elections. We see that, I remember being in 2 governments where one lasted almost 4 years, where there almost wasn't one moment of instability. And I remember being another one that lasted 15 months and there wasn't one day without some sort of crisis. And the prime minister basically, instead of running the country, had to put fires out in his own cabinet. And that doesn't lend itself very well to being able to run the country and thinking of long-term strategic answers to the many challenges which Israel faces. So I think, to me, to my mind, that should be on the agenda. I don't think it will be on the agenda. Part of what this coalition agreement states is, originally it said for 6 months that the Knesset will not deal and the government will not deal with any non-coronavirus issues. I think that was considered by the Supreme Court, as you said earlier, James, that it ruled on elements of the coalition agreement between Blue and White and Likud, and they basically agreed to limit that to 100 days. And instead of saying that it won't be able to deal with anything else, it put in language saying that coronavirus will obviously be given priority, which I think is fair enough. But there's still a certain amount of uncertainty. That the Supreme Court, while it ruled that there was nothing that they could find illegal about Prime Minister Netanyahu continuing as Prime Minister, and nothing inherently illegal about the agreement, they said that there are some very strong difficulties. But a lot of people talk about Israel's Supreme Court being one of the most activists in the world. But the interesting thing about this ruling is it said, while we find nothing inherently illegal at this point, we find many strong difficulties in this agreement, and we are not prepared to rule at this time. And they kept on repeating that. The head of the Supreme Court, Justice Hyatt, in her ruling that was accepted by all other 10 judges, it was 11-0 ruling. But I think we'll hear more about this agreement again. There was the question, for example, if Netanyahu vacates the prime minister position a year and a half for Benny Gantz, and then Netanyahu becomes the alternate prime minister, is that then considered the same level as a minister, which means legally he would have to resign? That's a question which some have said that there's hints of in the Supreme Court ruling. There's other parts of the agreement which, if they are implemented, the Supreme Court may then deem it necessary to insert itself and deem some of the policies or some of the steps taken unconstitutional, because we are changing. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, pretty much like the UK. We have quasi constitutional laws, basic laws, and some of those were changed to ensure that this unity government would happen. We have had unity governments in the past, and they've usually taken place at times of crisis, whether during war or in the early 80s. There was the Rabin Shamir unity government, but they didn't change the basic laws. It was basically a rotation government. There was a certain amount of trust. There's very little trust between Gantz and Netanyahu, at least at this point. So they had to really enshrine it in law, and they had to take steps.
Shimon Peres in 1984, not Rabin. Yitzhak Shamir.
Oh, right, sorry, Peres. Yeah.
I'm getting some questions coming through. People wondering why, if they know me, why I'm not interrupting you. I'm just picking up.
Okay, please feel free to.
because one has to be a political junkie to decode some of the things that you've just said. Now, I'm one of them. I'm monitoring the Israeli news nonstop and have been covering general elections since the 1980s in Israel. I find it fascinating, but some people call me very odd in that respect. Clearly, you keep your ears very close to the ground on this as well. There were some of the things that I was going to ask you, which you pretty much touched on. So I gave the basic intro and you have elaborated on a little bit. And I'm not sure how much this is going over some people's heads who are viewing this right now. So let me just take you back to the first point. You mentioned about polls. Now, at this point, it does not look like there's going to be a fourth general election, although based on what's happened over the last couple of months, anything can happen. But Netanyahu is polling, you mentioned 41, and I've seen some of those polls, 39, 40, 41 as well. One question which I have seen here on the screen is, why does Netanyahu not just throw the towel in and go for another election? What are your views on that?
I touched on it a little bit before. Because we're in the middle of a crisis, you never know where we'll be in 3 months. If Netanyahu would not have received over 61 or 60 plus his own signatures to hand into the president today, we would have automatically gone to elections in 3 months. Now there's another 2 weeks. As I said, there are those voices who still believe he may be heading there. But I think, first of all, because during a crisis, you never know the way the chips will fall in a week in Israel, or 3 weeks, let alone 3 months, especially with the coronavirus, unprecedented economic disaster, not just here in the UK and all around the world. So I think you would be gambling quite a lot to think that the numbers today would remain that way. But I think if you look at, sort of to go into Netanyahu's mind, if you look in the past, this is a person who likes big government. He likes the big numbers. He likes the stability that it gives him, the security it gives him. This is a person who's reached across the aisle many times. He's brought in Tzipi Livni to former governments, Ehud Barak to former governments, Isaac Herzog. There are many people from across the spectrum who are not big fans of his who've been brought in, quite simply because Netanyahu likes to have that stability and security of a big government, and also because he knows the greatest threat to him is on the right. So he feels quite comfortable bringing in those centrists, center-left. And I think he's basically clipped Benny Gantz's wings at this point. Benny Gantz ran on one issue, and that was to replace Netanyahu. So you can argue, yes, in elections, then he may be clipped even further, but you never know, someone else could come forward. The Labour Party has been driven into non-existence, according to the polls. But I think he gains more. As I said, if he goes to elections, and even if the most generous polls that we're seeing at the moment come to fruition, where he gets this 63, 64, that still means that any one party in the coalition can threaten him day after day after day. If you don't give me this, if you don't do that, I'm going to leave the election. I'm going to leave the government. Whereas you have a government of, what is it, 70, I think at the end it will be something 78. I mean, that's
if Yamina comes in.
If Yamina come in,
72
of course.
Right now. Yeah. So you mentioned the corona. So how much of a factor is the coronavirus for Benny Gantz to ditch Ya'alon, Bogi Ya'alon, and of course Yair Lapid? And if he really feels we have to put politics aside, let's just join up and form a government and sort out the current problems right now, why didn't Yair Lapid see the same as what Benny Gantz saw?
Well, first of all, that's dependent on that. If that was the real reason, I'm suspicious personally that was the real reason. I think that coronavirus gave them both a ladder to come down from their high trees. I think Benny Gantz knew that the situation wasn't getting any better for him. From the first elections to the third, he was, I don't know if you'd say hemorrhaging votes, but he was definitely losing out, and Netanyahu was only gaining seats, which is quite a remarkable testament to his political prowess, Netanyahu, that even though, he was the incumbent, and he had the ability to form a government and failed on a couple of occasions. So the fact that the people kept on giving him more, I think really is just I take my hat off to his political prowess. I'm not sure that there's any politician in the world who can achieve what he's achieved over the last year and a half. But I think Benny Gantz wanted the unity government. Yair Lapid one could argue, and my friends who work with you certainly would, that it was a more principled stand. You basically gained those votes on the back of saying, we will not go into Netanyahu's government. And there you do, taking those votes that were given to you on the basis of that into Netanyahu's government. So I'm not sure about that one. My personal belief is, and it's also speaking to some of the people involved, that I think coronavirus just gave them, both sides, a ladder to come down.
Okay. Let me move on to the US Secretary of State. According to one report in Israel, Mike Pompeo is expected to visit Israel next week. Presumably it's to talk about the possibility of putting some of the Jewish community blocks in the Shtachim, in the Judea and Samaria, on the Israeli sovereignty law. You talked about how this becomes Israeli law from July the 1st. Firstly, just explain to the viewers, how does it become Israeli law from July the 1st? What's wrong beforehand?
Well, first of all, it doesn't, there's nothing automatic. It means that nothing will be done until July 1st. Basically, ever since should I just go a little bit of the history about the difference between the Green Line and the territories over the Green Line and the law relating to them? Is that something I should get into?
Just briefly touch on it, yes.
So after the War of Independence, the War of Independence obviously was between Israel and multiple Arab countries. Israel and the Jordanian army stopped fighting on the Eastern Front, what you could call the Eastern Front, on what then became known as the Armistice Line, which then became known as the Green Line, because the generals who were sitting, I believe, in Crete or Corfu, basically demarcated this line where the army stopped with a green pen. Interestingly enough, if you see the armistice agreements, at the behest of the Jordanian side, it said these lines will have absolutely no political significance. They didn't want to recognize it as a border because recognizing it as a border would have meant recognizing the state of Israel on the other side, which is something they were only prepared to do in the 90s. So basically, it never became a border. It was just an armistice line, but Jordan was on the other side. And then obviously in 67, Israel, depending on where you come from on the political map, and occupied, liberated the territory, the real birthplace of Jewish civilization in Judea and Samaria, when we're talking about places like Hebron, places like that. But Israel never annexed it. It never claimed sovereignty. It did allow for communities to be built there, but they are not built in the sovereign state of Israel. The sovereign state of Israel stops at the 1949 Armistice Line, the Green Line. And the only places that it did place sovereignty or annex is Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And what this law, if they would choose to do it, is to annex certain parts, perhaps the Jordan Valley they're talking about. They're talking about some of the settlement blocks. There is a map in the Trump peace plan of areas that the Trump administration considers would be part of sovereign Israel. And there has been a committee put together between Israelis and Americans to look at these territories and to see what can be placed under Israeli sovereignty, what can't, what shouldn't be, perhaps in stages. But I think really the jury's out on this particular question. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think it will come with several conditions, which maybe some in the Netanyahu government will not accede to. There may be some symbolic. Sorry?
Just to be clear, the foregone conclusion, you don't think it is going to be some type of, let's use the word annexation then? I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm just
my personal belief is that Netanyahu may do some sort of symbolic annexation in certain areas. I don't believe he will go to the maximum, especially those to the right of him. If we understand Israeli politics, we understand that Netanyahu is probably as far left of the mainstream Likud party and pretty much every other member of Knesset in his party. I don't think he's a great advocate for it. I think he's been pushed there. I think he made a promise, and I think he has a very sympathetic American administration that maybe he wants to take advantage of. And people talk about maybe that would be his legacy. Maybe he sees it that way as well. but I don't think he'll annex as much as some would like on his right flank.
I'm sure that's probably correct. In your view, though, what does Benny Gantz think about this? He originally said a couple of months ago that he would support it if he got the go-ahead from the American administration. Right now, it looks like you have got that go-ahead. We'll have to see what Mike Pompeo says. What are your thoughts on?
I think, first of all, it depends about the go-ahead. There are certain parts of the American administration which are saying no, some that are saying go. Some, we're getting mixed signals. And also some are saying you can go, but with certain conditions, which would be unacceptable to other more right-wing elements within the government. What's remarkable is if you would have talked about annexation 5 years ago, you'd have found really only support on the extreme right. No mainstream parties had it as part of their platform. I think it was certainly Naftali Bennett who first put some sort of annexation on the table when he talked about Area C, which is the area given to for Israeli civilian and security control in the Oslo Accords. And I think ever since then, there's been a slow erosion of it being an issue which was, as I said, on the extremes. And now the fact is you have Benny Gantz, who is a relative centrist, and Amir Peretz and Yitzhak Shmuley from the Labour Party, the party of the left, the party that ran with Meretz, who is entering into a government where annexation is a central policy, which shows how mainstream annexation, at least at some level, really is. Benny Gantz has there is a certain, I would argue, Israeli consensus over, let's say, a limited annexation, whether it's the Jordan Valley. Many see that for security needs because that's what separates the West Bank, Judea and Samaria from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and that would be very important, especially as the Jordan itself is not the most stable countries. And when we look around what's happening in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the worst thing for Israel would be if that particular, if the king fell. So that's something which has always been seen going back into history. Ben Gurion and many other leaders of Jordan Valley was always considered extremely, extremely important. Mm-hmm. And then you have the major settlement blocks. Most people in Israel, from the center left all the way over to the extreme right, see areas like the Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, as a part of Israel, and it should be a part of Israel. This is what they would say. It's a few miles away from Jerusalem. The major settlement centers are very close to the Green Line. 80% of settlements and settlers live within a couple of miles of the Green Line. So it would be relatively easy to annex that without, breaking the concept of contiguity for a future Palestinian state, if that is, that is the principle and the policy of other nations around the world. It wouldn't necessarily challenge that by annexing some of the major settlement blocks and even the Jordan Valley. So I think Netanyahu will do something symbolic to ease his right flank, but not something too much that would anger perhaps those in America, Europe, and even in the region. We see fascinating things in the region with close relationships, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf region. And you show that the Palestinian issue was never the issue. But there is a nervousness that if you put it back on the agenda with, a sort of a forceful annexation of too much territory, perhaps it could then be placed back on. So those are some of the fears out there.
Sure. Just to be clear, though, in your opinion right now, you think that Ma'ale Adumim and the Gush Etzion block is feasible, that it could come under Israel's sovereignty with the, with the support of Mike Pompeo, but perhaps he may say, as he said in the previous weeks, look, the Israelis are free to do what it is that they do. It's not our business. You can see that happening.
Well, first of all, Israel is free to do what it wants if it doesn't want to take into consideration of international. So I think someone needs to be muted. It's able to do so. It has annexed territory in the past, as I said, whether it's Jerusalem or the Golan, which was under Menachem Begin's time. So Israel can do it. But there probably will be certain repercussions in the international arena. As I said, I think the Americans will want Israel to pay a price for it, will want some sort of quid pro quo. Some are saying that it needs to recognize a Palestinian state or take other steps, which would push, or at least...
So let me just jump in over here. Not sure, Steve, if you can mute the others. Keep me on if you can. Keep Ashley on if you can.
Yeah.
But maybe just mute the others. No offense to our viewers watching in. Got some questions just coming up over here anyway. So let me just scroll down by them. We talked briefly. Actually, we didn't really talk about the indictment, but the indictment doesn't seem to have made much difference. Elizabeth is asking, is it going to influence anything? I mean, at this point, my question would be on top of that, and you can answer Elizabeth's questions, is it going to influence anything? Clearly not, because the Supreme Court, the High Court, has voted that he can go ahead and form a government. When is Netanyahu expected to be in court? Because this date keeps being put off.
Well, my personal belief is that the indictment has affected everything since even before there was an indictment. I believe that we went to first elections to get ahead of the indictment. That was the plan, because, you know, going to elections on indictment at least was considered to be something of a handicap. In the end, it wasn't. You know, Netanyahu was able to rally supporters, not just despite, but maybe because of it. You know, much like certain other leaders around the world, there's been a rallying against the legal system. You know, the Attorney General who indicted Netanyahu was a Netanyahu, was as closest to Netanyahu as you could get, and he was personally appointed to his position. But I believe that everything that's happened in the last year and a half, and probably everything that will happen moving forward, is very much run according to Netanyahu's legal issues. It's a debate whether he needs to actually appear in court himself, but the court case was put off from, I believe, in April because of coronavirus. It's expected to start in June, but this will go on for years. I mean, everybody has seen from the beginning that Netanyahu's lawyers have, tried to elongate the pace of this legal process as much as possible. And even if he is convicted, there'll be so many appeals. And they say that it may not be exhausted for 3, 4, 5, maybe even more years. So I don't think that that will necessarily bring him down. But I definitely think that it's something that he keeps an eye on very much, and has dictated the pace of Israeli politics for the year and a half and possibly more.
Okay, we have this agreement in place as well. The government is set to form and sit in the Knesset next Wednesday. I think it's the 13th of May. What are the chances, is asking Noam, what are the chances of Bibi Netanyahu, after 18 months, pulling out of the government?
Well, now originally they set the date for the swearing in, I believe, next Wednesday, but now they're putting it off because of the expected visit of Secretary of State Pompeo.
Right, another week.
Right. If I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet against Netanyahu finding some way to pull out of the government in advance of giving it over to Benny Gantz, unless, as I said before, unless he wants to become president, unless that's his end game to become president. There has been, at the last minute, an extension of this agreement. Originally, it was supposed to be a year and a half Netanyahu, a year and a half Gantz, 3 years, whereas usually the Israeli government is 4.5 years. But now there's been an extension, 9 months each. So there's another round for Netanyahu, another round for Gantz afterwards. I don't think anyone sees that anything more than just trying to get round the Supreme Court's difficulties with having a government only sit for 3 years ahead of time. But in theory, it does give some sort of justification for Netanyahu to sit for a year and a half to wait to his turn again. But I'd be very surprised if it lasts more than 3 years, this government. I mean, on average, Israeli governments don't necessarily anyway.
Recently, they've been fairly stable every 4 years, except for the 2013 to 2015. So 3 years is not bad under the circumstances. Can you just explain, for my sake as well, there was one of the many petitions to the High Courts, which sat Sunday and Monday, as I mentioned in the introduction as well. They were also discussing as to whether, if Netanyahu was to pull out after 18 months, and therefore technically the government should fall, Benny Gantz was saying, hang on a second, no, it wouldn't, because I'm still going to sit as prime minister for at least another 3 months. Is that on the cards?
Well, actually, even longer. They were discussing for quite a while how, because there was so little trust between Gantz and Netanyahu, they really had to enshrine in law that there would be this exchange of positions. So one of the things that are in the agreement is that not only would If Netanyahu did break up the government, then it would immediately be conferred on Benny Gantz. Not only would he get those 3 months in the lead up to election, he'd actually get another 3 months before that, so that he would be in the position for 6 months. But I don't think that's much of a threat, because it would be a lame duck government. It wouldn't have a majority. It wouldn't be able to do anything, and it would be a government in name only and a prime minister in name only.
Actually, do you not agree, though, that that's, for some who may say that breaks up this consistency? I mean, Netanyahu by that time would have been prime minister for a consistent amount of, I think it's 13 and a half years. So there are some people who are 16, 17, perhaps going into the army, who've never known another prime minister before. And then from Benny Gantz's point of view, at least that breaks up the cycle. And now people can psychologically think maybe there could be somebody else after Netanyahu.
Yes, there certainly is that. But there's a lot of other things to be taken into consideration. Just sitting in that chair may cross the Rubicon for a lot of Israelis who've not known. Don't forget about people who are in the army, because when you're young, you don't really think about politics. Just think there are people, let's say from 15 years, who at that point will be, almost 30 and have never known, during their sort of their professional career, no other prime minister except Netanyahu. It's certainly a debate, and I do agree that could be a factor. But I think what we've seen, one thing that we know to be certain, is Netanyahu is the professional, and Benny Gantz has shown himself to be a little bit amateurish, especially over the last few weeks, giving up a very strong hand before he got what he wanted out of the coalition agreement. He got certain things he wanted. He could have played much harder ball and got a lot more. He was in the driving seat, and he basically gave it over without really too many guarantees. And in theory, Netanyahu, now he's been given the opportunity to form a government, can actually say to Benny Gantz, thank you very much for giving me this position. Now enjoy the opposition. In theory, he could do that. I don't think it's likely.
Because he's the Knesset speaker, so he would have control of the Knesset.
He would have control of the Knesset. I'm not sure exactly if they would be able to have another vote on the Knesset. Also, he'd have to convince Tzvika Hauser and Hendel, who've said that they will only be prepared to sit in unity government, to say, I'm prepared to sit in a now right-wing government, which they've said they won't. But
time moves by very, very quickly. So let me just fire off a couple of questions. Some brief answers, if I may request as well. Josh is asking, in your opinion, what's the feeling on the street of annexation? I suppose it depends upon which part of the country you're in.
According to polls, it's not a majority, but it's a strong minority in favor of some level. We saw a poll yesterday undertaken by a left-wing organization whose interest it is to show, as little support as possible. And the language was attacked by some because it didn't say exactly what would be annexed. It gave the impression to annex the whole territory, which I think you'd find much less. I think if they limited it to, as I said, the major settlement blocks in the Jordan Valley, I think probably around half of the country would support it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me scroll through these as well. Malcolm is asking, in your opinion, Victor Lieberman, is he any way responsible for the situation that we are in right now? After all, he was on the right wing and he chose not to go ahead and join the right wing, and then threw his cards behind Benny Gantz and the center left.
Well, I can tell you that, many people from the outside see Israel on the sort of right-left axes. And that was pretty much the reality for many decades in Israel. But ever since the 80s, at least, the right-wing axis had been bolstered by the presence of the ultra-Orthodox. So it became the right-wing ultra-Orthodox axis. And what Victor Lieberman did is he broke that up by saying, I am right-wing. I agree with you on many security and defense issues. But on the issue of religion and state, I stand very much against what the ultra-Orthodox are trying to do. Again, this is a person who's not anti-religious. I know him personally. He's a traditional guy. His family is all religious, and he is very respectful. He doesn't want to separate church from state in Israel, but he does want to equalize Israeli society. He does want to make it where all Israelis are treated the same way. Those who contribute most will receive most, and those who contribute least will receive least. It doesn't matter from where you come. And certainly he was a major, major player in the collapse of the potentially first government after the elections. But after that, a unity government was something that he was pushing for. And Netanyahu and Gantz could have formed a government after the second elections quite easily. But because of a lack of trust, they weren't able to. Had nothing to do with Victor Lieberman. He certainly pushed unity as the only option. And both sides claimed that they wanted unity. But in the end, they weren't able to make that deal. So that wasn't really, it's hard to blame Lieberman at that point. But certainly he was a major part in the process, in the beginning of the process.
And a final question from myself. And that is with regard to the ministries. So the agreement, the coalition agreement between Likud and Blue and White is agreed right now 30 ministers, possibly rising to 36 ministers. So with that comes a great deal of expense and security, the cars, the highest salaries, etc. at a time that, as you mentioned and alluded to earlier, 27% of the Israeli workforce is out of work. Many of them are really struggling at the moment. What is the feeling towards politics and the Knesset? Is it worse than what it was before? Is it about the same?
I think after a year and a half, forget about this particular question. I think there's certainly a lot of lack of trust in the political class that has basically left us in this instability for a year and a half. There's a lot of disaffection, although interestingly enough, the numbers who came out and voted didn't go down. In fact, I think they even rose in all three elections.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
it certainly is. It is. But I think that it is an issue, especially for detractors of this government. But I don't, and I think Netanyahu knows this and Gantz knows this, that, we have so many big challenges to face that there will be certain murmurs about the waste, quote unquote, of this big government. But I don't think that will last very long. And it's what they would say is a necessary evil to make sure that we have this emergency government during this crisis. So I don't think that resentment will last too long. There'll be certainly many other issues to bring up. But,
Ashley,
excuse me.
Really appreciate your time this evening as well. For those who are just joining us, it's Ashley Perry who is with us. He's the International Strategic and Communications Consultant, also a public relations advisor, as well as has advised in previous times the Foreign Minister and also the Deputy Prime Minister, who we mentioned before, who was Victor Lieberman. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for your insights and your input as well. And also thank you very much to the Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization for putting these weekly, I'm not sure if they're weekly, but regular webinars where there's a guest every so often. Next up is the Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. It's not clear exactly which day this will be, the webinar, but there will be a guest, and the Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization are requesting that you look out in the next few days for some more advertisements about this, and there it will confirm the day, the time, and of course the guest as well. So once again, thanks very much to our viewers. Thank you again to Ashley, and thank you to the Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization. Good night to you.